Chapter 1. The Restless Orphan. The bell echoed through the narrow halls of Larkspur High, its sharp clang reverberating like a judge's gavel. Students spilled from classrooms in bursts of noise and motion, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of gossip, laughter, and shouted goodbyes. Lockers slammed shut, the hollow clangs blending with the rhythmic squeak of sneakers on polished linoleum. Liora Ashford lingered at her desk, pretending to rummage through her bag as the other students filed out. Her biology textbook lay unopened in front of her, the page still turned to an early chapter on cell division that she hadn't bothered to read. Another day, she thought, her lips pressing into a thin line. Another reminder I don't belong. A group of girls brushed past her, their voices rising and falling in effortless camaraderie. Liora caught snippets of their conversation: weekend plans, a new movie, someone's disastrous attempt at a dance video. The words floated by, meaningless to her, like static on a forgotten channel. She stood and slung her bag over one shoulder, keeping her head low as she slipped into the hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, their cold glare washing the hallway in sterile light. Liora walked with her head down, her steps quiet amid the clamor of students spilling from classrooms. Leora's sneakers scuffed against the floor, her steps quiet amid the clamor. She adjusted the strap of her bag, letting it press against her side like a shield. Around her, clusters of students moved as one, their laughter echoing through the space. Ahead of her, near the water fountain, two boys leaned against the lockers, their conversation hushed but audible in the echoing corridor. "Does she ever talk to anyone?" one of them muttered, his voice tinged with curiosity. The other shrugged, glancing in her direction. "Why would she? She's always staring off like she's in some other world." The words hit her like a pebble to the back, small but sharp. Leora's jaw tightened and she quickened her pace, brushing past them without a glance. The classroom wasn't much of an escape. The desks were arranged in neat rows, their surfaces scarred with years of graffiti, initials, crude drawings, and the occasional curse word etched into the wood. Liora took her usual seat by the window, letting her gaze drift outside as the teacher began a droning lecture on the Industrial Revolution. The world beyond the glass was alive in a way the classroom never could be. The oak trees lining the schoolyard swayed gently in the autumn breeze, their golden leaves fluttering like coins caught in the sunlight. A squirrel darted along the branches, its movements quick and sure, disappearing into the foliage with a flick of its tail. Liora pressed her hands flat against the desk, her palms faintly warm. She couldn't remember when it had started, this strange heat that bubbled up from inside her. It wasn't painful, but it was constant, like an ember that refused to die. The teacher's voice blurred into the background, a monotonous hum that barely registered. Leora's mind wandered, her thoughts drifting to questions she couldn't answer. Who was she really? What was she supposed to be? She glanced down at her hands, frowning as the warmth spread to her fingertips. A faint flicker of light caught her eye, and for a moment, she thought she saw something. An almost imperceptible glow tracing the lines of her palm. She blinked, and it was gone, leaving her heart racing in its wake. "Liora." The teacher's voice cut through her thoughts, sharp and impatient. She snapped her head up, meeting his disapproving gaze. "Yes?" "I asked you to read the next paragraph," he said, tapping the open textbook on his desk. Heat rose to her cheeks as she fumbled with her book, flipping pages until she found the right spot. The words blurred together, her embarrassment turning them into a meaningless jumble. I don't have it," she mumbled, avoiding his gaze. The teacher sighed, shaking his head. "Pay attention, Miss Ashford. Daydreaming won't get you very far." When the bell finally rang, releasing them into the late afternoon, Liora felt a pang of relief. She stepped into the crisp air, the scent of freshly mowed grass mingling with the faint chill of autumn. The courtyard was bustling with students, their laughter and chatter filling the space. Liora lingered by the edge, watching as clusters formed and dissolved, their movements fluid and easy. She spotted a girl with auburn curls, the same one who'd whispered about her in the hallway. The girl was laughing now, her arm slung casually around a friend's shoulder. They radiated warmth and belonging, the kind of effortless connection Liora had always envied. Why can't I fit in? She wondered, her throat tightening. Why does it always feel like I'm on the outside, looking in? She turned away, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her jacket. As she crossed the parking lot, her gaze caught on something, a flicker of light near the storm drain by the curb. She paused, frowning. The light was faint, barely visible in the shadows, but it seemed to pulse, like the dying glow of a firefly. It's nothing, she told herself, shaking her head, but as she walked away, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that it was something. The day ended as it always did, with Liora walking home beneath a sky that promised rain. The clouds hung low and heavy, their gray edges blurring into the horizon. Her footsteps echoed against the pavement, the sound swallowed by the stillness of the small town. It was a place where nothing ever changed, where the days bled into each other in a cycle of monotony. But as she reached the worn path that led to the Evans household, a flicker of determination sparked in her chest. There has to be more to this life than this, she thought, her grip tightening on the strap of her bag. She didn't know what more looked like, but she could feel it, just beyond her reach, a calling, faint but insistent, pulling her towards something greater. The Evans household was exactly as Liora had left it that morning, dim, cramped, and humming faintly with the noise of the ancient refrigerator in the kitchen. The smell of reheated casserole clung stubbornly to the air, mingling with the faint tang of mildew that no amount of cleaning ever seemed to banish. Liora slipped through the front door, dropping her bag beside the entryway with a soft thud. She kicked off her sneakers, leaving them askew on the worn mat, and headed for the stairs. Liora. Mrs. Evans's voice stopped her mid-step. It wasn't a greeting. Liora turned reluctantly, her hand gripping the banister. Mrs. Evans stood in the doorway to the living room, a dishcloth slung over her shoulder. Her face, lined with years of care and frustration, was a familiar mask of tired resolve. "We need to talk," she said, gesturing for Liora to join her. Leora's heart sank, but she obeyed, shuffling into the living room. She perched on the edge of the threadbare couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The room was a mishmash of mismatched furniture, a faded armchair, a coffee table scarred with countless rings from forgotten mugs, and a sagging love seat that had long since lost its shape. The overhead light flickered faintly, casting uneven shadows across the walls. Mrs. Evans sat across from her, her hands resting on her knees. For a moment she said nothing, just watching Liora with that quiet, searching gaze that always made her squirm. "You can't keep going like this," Mrs. Evans said finally, her voice steady but firm. "Skipping chores, barely speaking to anyone, staring off into space like you're in another world. You're 17, Liora. You need to think about your future." Leora's jaw tightened. She looked down at her hands, her fingers curling into her palms. "I do think about it," she muttered, though even she didn't believe the words. Mrs. Evans sighed, leaning forward. "I won't be around to take care of you forever. One day, you're going to have to stand on your own 2 feet. The world isn't going to wait for you to figure it out." Leora's head snapped up, her eyes flashing with frustration. "I never asked you to take care of me," she shot back, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "And maybe I don't belong here anyway." The room seemed to still. Mrs. Evans's expression hardened, the faint lines around her mouth deepening. "The world doesn't revolve around your daydreams," she said, her tone sharper now. "Grow up, Liora." Mrs. Evans sighed and glanced at the mantel, where a small photograph sat in a weathered frame. In the picture, a younger version of herself smiled awkwardly at the camera, a toddler cradled in her arms. She reached out as if to touch the photo, then let her hand fall to her lap. "I may not have all the answers, Liora," she said, her voice softer. "But I've tried to give you a home. That has to count for something." Something inside Liora cracked. The heat she'd been holding back all day surged to the surface, radiating through her chest and into her hands. The air in the room grew heavy, a palpable warmth that made the walls feel closer. The overhead light flickered again, more violently this time, casting jagged shadows across the room. Leora's pulse pounded in her ears, drowning out Mrs. Evans's voice as the anger roared to life inside her. "You don't understand," Liora shouted, rising to her feet. You don't understand what it's like to feel this weight, like I'm supposed to be something more, but I don't know what." The words hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. For a moment, neither of them moved. Mrs. Evans's gaze softened, but only slightly. "Life isn't about waiting for something to happen to you," she said quietly. "It's about what you make of it. You're so caught up in what you think you're missing that you can't see what's right in front of you." The heat in Leora's chest flared, searing and uncontainable. She clenched her fists, her nails biting into her palms as she fought to keep it in check. "You don't know anything about me," she said, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion. As she turned to leave, her shoulder brushed against the standing lamp by the couch. The bulb shattered with a sharp pop, the fragments raining down onto the carpet. Mrs. Evans flinched, her eyes wide. "Leora!" But Leora was already halfway up the stairs, her footsteps pounding against the wood. In the sanctuary of her room, Leora slammed the door shut and leaned against it, her chest heaving. The heat that had consumed her moments ago was already fading, leaving behind a hollow ache. She pressed her palms to her face, her skin still tingling with residual warmth. The shattered bulb replayed in her mind, sharp and vivid. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened. A flickering streetlight, a sparking toaster, a candle flame dancing wildly in its holder. Small, inexplicable moments that seemed to follow her anger or fear. She crossed the room to her bed, sinking onto the mattress. Her hands rested in her lap, trembling slightly. "What's wrong with me?" she whispered. The words felt too big for the quiet room, but they hung there unanswered. The attic door creaked open, the sound sharp and jarring against the muffled stillness of the house. Leora climbed the narrow staircase, each step groaning under her weight. The air grew cooler as she ascended, heavy with the scent of mildew and old wood. She reached the top and pulled the cord of a single bulb hanging from the rafters. Its light flickered once before settling into a dim, amber glow, casting long shadows across the cluttered space. The attic was a graveyard of forgotten things, trunks and boxes stacked haphazardly, furniture draped in dusty sheets, and a cobwebbed rocking horse sitting forlornly in one corner. But something about the attic felt different tonight. The air was heavier, pressing against her chest like an unseen weight. Her footsteps echoed softly, stirring motes of dust that hung suspended in the dim, flickering light. She paused as a faint creak broke the silence, her breath hitching. The sound came again, sharper this time, from the shadows behind a stack of old trunks. She shook her head. "It's just the house," she murmured, but the words felt hollow. As she moved closer, the silence seemed to deepen, swallowing the faint hum of the light bulb. A whisper, low and indistinct, brushed past her ear, too faint to catch the words, but enough to send a chill down her spine. Leora's footsteps stirred motes of dust that floated lazily in the air. She wrapped her arms around herself, though the chill wasn't what made her uneasy. There was something about the attic that felt different tonight, a heaviness in the air that pressed against her chest. She moved toward the back, past a stack of old photo albums and a cracked mirror propped against the wall. A faded trunk caught her eye, its surface marked with years of wear. She knelt beside it, brushing her fingers over the worn leather. "If I can't find answers here," she whispered to herself, "where do I even begin?" The trunk creaked open, its hinges protesting loudly. Inside were neatly folded linens yellowed with age and a collection of knickknacks, an old music box, a bundle of letters tied with twine, a tarnished locket. She sifted through them carefully, her hands trembling slightly as she dug deeper. Beneath the linens she found it. It was a small, unassuming box, its edges singed as though it had been licked by fire. The leather was cracked, the clasps rusted, but something about it called to her. Her breath caught as she lifted it from the trunk, the weight of it surprising. She set it on the floor and hesitated, her fingers hovering over the latch. "Mom," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "If you're out there somewhere, what would you say to me now?" The latch gave way with a soft click. Inside, wrapped in a square of faded cloth, was a key. It wasn't like any key she'd ever seen. It was larger, its surface etched with intricate swirling symbols that seemed to shift as she looked at them. The metal had a faint, golden sheen, though it didn't reflect the light the way it should have. When she reached out to touch it, a jolt shot through her fingers like static electricity but warmer. She pulled her hand back, staring at the key as though it might move. Her curiosity overpowered her hesitation. She reached out again, more carefully this time, and let her fingers brush against the metal. A jolt shot through her hand, sharp and electric, sending a shiver racing up her arm. She gasped, pulling back, her fingers tingling with residual warmth. The key pulsed, its surface glowing brighter as if it had been waiting for her touch. A flare of golden light illuminated the attic, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. The warmth spread up her arm, enveloping her like a comforting embrace, but it was tinged with something deeper, something alive. The warmth spread through her hand and up her arm, a comforting heat that felt alive. The symbols on the key glowed faintly, their light pulsing like a heartbeat. Leora's breath hitched. The attic seemed to shift around her, the shadows growing darker, the air thicker. A faint whisper tickled the edge of her hearing, a sound like wind rustling through leaves, and then the vision came. Fire. It blazed across her mind, vivid and all-consuming. The air smelled of ash and brimstone, acrid and choking, as though the flames had devoured every breath of life. The ground beneath her feet cracked and glowed with molten heat, sending up waves of searing air that made her skin prickle. In the distance, the crystal spire loomed, its jagged edges refracting the fiery landscape into fractured, prismatic hues. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through her chest like the warning growl of some great, unseen beast. As she watched, the shadows near the spire twisted and writhed, their tendrils reaching upward with unnatural fluidity. One shadow turned, and she felt its gaze pierce through her. A pair of glowing red eyes locked onto her, and the hum deepened into a guttural whisper. It was not words but intent, a promise of something dark and inevitable. A burning landscape stretched out before her, the ground cracked and glowing with molten light. In the distance, a towering crystal spire pierced the sky, its surface shimmering with the colors of a dying sunset. Shadows moved at its base, dark figures that twisted and writhed like living smoke. The vision faded as quickly as it came, leaving her gasping for breath. She dropped the key, and it landed with a soft thud on the floor, the glow of its symbols fading. The attic was silent again, but the stillness felt different now. Heavy, expectant. Liora pressed a hand to her chest, her heartbeat racing. "What the hell was that?" she whispered, her voice shaking. She stared at the key, its unassuming form betraying nothing of the power it had just shown her. Part of her wanted to put it back in the box, close the lid, and pretend she'd never found it. But another part, deeper and stronger, knew that wasn't an option. "This has to mean something," she said, her voice steadier now. She picked up the key again, cradling it in her hands. The warmth was still there, a steady pulse that seemed to echo her own heartbeat. She stood, the box tucked under her arm, and made her way back toward the stairs. As she reached the door, a faint rumble shook the attic, so soft it could have been her imagination. Leora paused, glancing over her shoulder. The shadows seemed to press closer now, their edges darker and sharper, but when she blinked, the room was as it had been. Silent, dusty, and still. She descended the stairs, the key clutched tightly in her hand. Whatever this was, whatever it meant, she couldn't ignore it. Not anymore. Leora sat cross-legged on the attic floor, her back resting against the cracked wooden beam that supported the low-sloping roof. The dim bulb overhead flickered again, casting uneven light across the cluttered space. The key lay in her hands, its faint warmth now fading to a subtle pulse. She traced the shifting symbols with her fingertips, marveling at how they seemed to shimmer just beneath the surface, like embers waiting to ignite. Her breath came slow and shallow, the adrenaline of her discovery ebbing away, leaving an aching quiet in its place. "What are you trying to tell me, Mom?" she whispered, her voice breaking the stillness. The question felt too big for the room, but she let it hang there, unanswered. The attic had grown colder, the air heavy with the smell of old wood and dust. Outside the small, round window, the moon hung low in the sky, its pale light spilling across the town below. Shadows stretched long and thin across rooftops, their edges sharp against the silvery glow. Leora's gaze lingered on the window, her thoughts a whirl of uncertainty and longing. The vision had left her shaken, its vivid imagery burned into her mind. The flames, the spire, the shadows, they felt more real than any dream she'd ever had. The key pulsed again, faint and rhythmic, as though it were alive. She clenched it tightly, her knuckles whitening. The faint rumble returned, vibrating through the floorboards and sending a shiver up her spine. It wasn't loud, just a soft, low tremor that seemed to come from deep within the earth. The light above flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows that danced across the walls. Leora's heart raced. She glanced around the attic, her eyes darting to the dark corners where the light couldn't reach. The silence felt oppressive, the air charged with something unseen. But as quickly as it had started, the rumble subsided, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. The bulb steadied, its glow soft and constant once more. Her grip on the key relaxed slightly, though her fingers still trembled. She forced herself to take a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs. "Something's waking up," she murmured, the words unbidden but certain. Her voice was barely audible, but in the quiet of the attic it felt loud. "Inside me, and beyond me." She leaned her head back against the beam, her gaze drifting to the window again. The moonlight seemed brighter now, illuminating the rooftops and casting the town in a stark, dreamlike clarity. Leora tightened her hold on the key, its edges pressing into her palm. Whatever this was, whatever her mother had left behind, it had found her now. And deep down, she knew there was no going back. Something was waking up, inside her and beyond her, and she couldn't stop it.